call. So as I said, I'm just introducing it. My name is Jeremy Groves. I work at the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment in the Geospatial and Information Analytics branch. And I had the pleasure to be able to manage this project over the last year. So I'd say good morning to everyone and welcome. I hope you had a good weekend. So this talk is about unlocking 20 years of trapped knowledge from PDFs. This session, I'd like to say, will be recorded. So if you want to re-see it or share it with people, we'll put it up and send you a link so that you can share it. So the lead research scientist on this is Dr. Stephen Wan from Data61 CSIRO. Stephen is a computer scientist specialist in computer linguistics, an interdisciplinary field that draws on both linguistics and computer science. His research employs natural language processing and text mining methods in conjunction with machine learning, information retrieval and human-computer interaction techniques. He's got over 15 years experience in computer linguistics and leads a team of software engineers and researchers to build information management systems for a variety of text data types. A common element of these systems is the need to extract actionable nuggets of information that will help with the user's task. His team has developed many systems used by both government and private sector in areas such as business intelligence, social media monitoring, and information systems for science literature. So I'll hand it over to Stephen, and thank you very much for coming and presenting today, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the introduction, and it's been a pleasure to work with you on this project to date. And I'd like to say good morning to everybody. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, and to pay my respects to the elders past and present. So today I'd like to share some of the outcomes of a pilot project that we've been conducting with the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. And often the data sets, the document sets we hold in our organizations, they're potentially useful, and they can have a positive game-changing effect on the way we operate if only we could unlock this knowledge from its written form and from their formats in PDF. So in this talk, I'm going to highlight how we built and trialed different methods to unlock this knowledge, and I'll be talking about how we did this for a data set relating to the conservation of Australian fauna and flora. And I'll outline our plans for exploring some different productivity gains with this information. So let me start with a little bit of context. In Australia, we have the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is intended to help manage the process of protecting fauna and flora. Now, at this point, I'd like to remind everybody that I'm a researcher in computational linguistics and natural language processing, so I'm not an expert in the conservation of protected species, but my intention here is to share with you, especially if you're from outside this field like I am, some of the background of the text documents that we'll be working with, that we were working with, and hence my presentation of the simplified view here on the screen. So in brief, when a species, for example, the eastern barred bandicoot, is threatened, a case is prepared for that species to be officially recognized as such. The conservation advice that's created is a statutory document that outlines the case for a particular classification, vulnerable or endangered, and it typically includes information such as the descriptive section about the species, its habitat, and its documented threats. Once the species gets an official classification, there may be an accompanying recovery plan that is produced to outline the activities that can be undertaken to help mitigate the risks to the species or to address the various threats that the species face. And this recovery plan is what is used to help with the conservation efforts as represented by the diagram on the right. These two documents are vetted by a threatened species scientific community before they are officially endorsed by the minister. So the thing to note here is that all that knowledge that has gone into preparing the case and the recovery plan, it tends to exist only in these documents. There are no reusable structured representations of these documents, or if there are, they're manually curated at a particular time based on a snapshot of the documents, say in a particular year. So there's an example there in the top right-hand corner. In 2016, there was an effort to go through those documents to look for threats to species, and that was a manual process. What would be ideal is a reusable database that's generated automatically from whatever the current collection of conservation advices and recovery plans happens to be at that particular time. So in this project, we're going to be interested in the text of these documents and helping to generate this automatically generate this reusable database. Just to make things a little bit more complicated, we're going to be completely in the dark about the downstream data analysis. So we don't know in advance what research questions a data analyst is going to have when they come to look at this reusable data. That is, we want our database to be able to support any downstream analysis. In practical terms, this means we don't have a schema to import the data into, and we don't even know in advance what facts are going to be relevant for that data scientist who's going to look at this data at some point in the future. The end result is our aim is to collect as much of the knowledge out of these documents as possible. But fortunately, we suspect that natural language processing methods have a role to play here. So let me just say a little bit about natural language processing. Broadly speaking, there are two types: natural language understanding and natural language generation. In so-called understanding, natural language understanding, what is typically meant is the automatic production of some structured representation when given a sample of text. In text generation, it's the reverse. We start with a structured representation and we automatically generate that text. But natural language processing is a hard problem. We've seen limited applications of NLP, natural language processing, in things like web search, handheld computing, translation, for example. But it's not clear how these technologies will work when we deploy them in a new usage scenario or with a new document data set. So in this project, we've focused on an investigation of the feasibility of the combination of PDF tools and natural language processing tools to see how these could work together to convert as much of the content in those documents into some structured data. And as I said, we're agnostic of the end usage by the data analyst. So there's both a research focus, but an engineering focus as well. And we want to study which methods work best for the document set, but also create a software artifact that embodies the technologies that do work, so that the department could progress its internal discussion about how best to utilize these technologies. And finally, we want to keep our software and our application as general as possible so that future applications could potentially use our software, and we could try new data sets, new document data sets with this to see how we can apply this in multiple contexts in government and industry, as was part of the initial scope of the project as when it was funded as part of the Australian government's platform for open data. So that's the high-level problem that we're trying to solve. In the remainder of this talk, I'm going to touch on the kinds of technologies that will be relevant to solving a problem like this. And I'll show you a little bit of the data and talk about some of the technical challenges that we face in deploying this sort of method. And I will describe at a high level what our software solution looks like and what the results of our feasibility study were. In this feasibility study, I'll just say that this is the first step that we were on to create that reusable data set. So right at the end, in the fourth section, I'll describe some of the current methods, current directions that we're exploring to see how we can utilize this database within the department to support some of the department workflows. So let's dive into the problem a little bit and look at the problem of extracting knowledge from the PDFs. The first question we should ask is, what do we really mean when we say extracting knowledge from PDFs? Well, let's start with the PDFs and extracting information. Some of you might be saying, well, hang on, isn't this already a solved problem? I mean, we see cloud providers like Amazon with products like Textract, and they do a great transformation of the PDF into a machine-readable text. And if you are handy with tools like Microsoft Word or Adobe Acrobat, you've seen that you can convert the PDF into text or HTML relatively easily. And there are open source solutions that we can draw on, like Apache Tika and Mozilla's PDF.js. But these are just really the first of a series of components that we're going to use. They convert the PDF into some machine-readable form, either a text file or something a little bit more structured, like an HTML web page. What we need is a further conversion from the information in the machine-readable text file into a structured representation that is closer to the knowledge that this text represents. So for the sentence on the left, you might say the core information in there might be that there is a causal relationship that holds between two things, something about drought and something about mortality. That is, drought causes mortality, as is represented in this sentence. And that's the key knowledge structure. We call this a triple, a knowledge triple, as it contains three parts: the two arguments, drought and mortality, and the relationship, causality. And it is this structure that is currently beyond commercial tools to deploy in an open domain setting. And so that's where we need to bring in some of the bleeding edge research in natural language processing and artificial intelligence. Well, there are some relevant tools, and some of you may have worked with named entity recognition and might be wondering how this factor in. Well, yes, it is a related technology. And so I've depicted here on screen how a named entity recognition tool might produce some results, color coding some of the different entities here. And here you can see we're talking about scientific entities ranging from quite general entities to the specific. But in general, NER, and particularly named entity recognition, and NER for specific data sets, like a scientific domain, is far from a solved task. It's different from the kind of results that you might get from a tool that you might download, which off the shelf, which might give you something like the person or the proper name of a person, the proper name of an organization, a location, and possibly some numerical text types like data currency. So the key observation here is that even if we had a scientific named entity recognition tool, it would only help for part of the problem. Not all the arguments, as you saw in that previous example, are named entities. And so our approach needs to be able to handle all kinds of arguments like attributes. More importantly, it doesn't tell us about the nature of the relationship that holds between the detected entities. In this work, we're going to look at a body of research called open information extraction. The term open refers to the generality of the solution. The approach is unconstrained by a specific ontology. And indeed, the very first researchers who worked in this field were trying to produce a structure of all the text documents that you find on the web. So that's quite an ambitious goal, and there's no single ontology that would span all that content. Information extraction here simply refers to the conversion of that unstructured text into some structured form. So you'll see here that a sample open information extraction solution might create something on the right there where the triple is made of verbatim text. So the arguments, they aren't the proper names or nice domain concepts as before. So it's not drought, but drought and incidences of extreme heat. So we draw that directly from the sentence. And it's not mortality as the second argument, but very significant mortality. And for the relationship, it's not causality, but the verb phrase are also known to cause. So we pull that verbatim from the sentence, and we create the triple from these parts. We're going to, when we deploy this technology, impose a little bit of a few extra criteria for our solution. So our version of open information extraction is that our solution should be able to convert all the content in the sentence, not just part of the sentence, but as much as possible, we'll convert the entire sentence into one or more knowledge triples. And we're going to identify all the eligible sentences in the document, and every eligible sentence would ideally be converted in this manner. This means, of course, we have to identify what's an eligible sentence, and I'll come back to this later, but basically it means we want to skip things like page footers, bibliographies, the things that aren't the prose text that contain that key information that we're looking for. So the pros of the open information extraction method is that we can process all the content in the PDF. It's quite general, but this is a difficult task. It's much harder than the data science task of named entity recognition, for example. And for the data analysts out there, it's much more difficult because we don't have ground truth to train a supervised machine learning approach for this solution. So let's have a look at some of the data in more detail and some of the technical challenges that we'll have to overcome to get the open information extraction methods to work. In this work, we start with nearly 2,000 PDF documents. You can see that these are divided into various subsets for conservation advices and recovery plans. And these are divided into documents for an individual species and documents for a threatened ecological community. And you can have a look at the average number of pages in the last row. So recovery plans tend to be longer, and documents about the ecological community tend to be longer than those for the species. This is some of the some conventional structure to these documents, and it's more evident in the conservation advices. So conservation advices, as I've shown here, they tend to start with a summary of the classification of the species, followed by some information about about the species itself, its distribution in the wild, relationship to the community, and then it's perhaps followed by a summary of threats. And the recovery plans tend to have a little bit more detail that addresses, outlines those threats and addresses ways to mitigate the risks and produce a list of perhaps some research actions that could be undertaken. So these PDF documents are, they're in this set, they're completely digital. So they don't include any scans, of pages. And so our solution here and our project here is focusing on fully digital PDFs where documents have some similar structure based on some conventional use of a guiding template. So typically after PDF digitization, one ends up with a machine readable text that contains all the raw content, which leads us to the first technical challenge, that of determining the structure of the document from the raw text. You can see here in the machine readable text, there are different lines. Some of these relate to boilerplate text, titles, section headings, and footers. We don't want to push this content to the open information extraction tool. These tools are expecting well-formed grammatical sentences. As a secondary problem, you can see that some of the lines of text don't correspond to things that are a full sentence. So we may potentially have to stitch together these lines and then find the starts and ends of paragraphs and sentences. All of this results in the challenge of determining structure from which we can then pick out the eligible content. And if you get this wrong, if you get this very basic first step wrong, it severely limits the quality of the knowledge triples that you end up producing. The second challenge is in finding multi-word entities, particularly those that might confuse the natural language processing tools like open information extraction that occur further down in our data pipeline. For example, in the sentence here, is hunter a single noun? Is weeping a verb? To us, it's obvious that hunter is part of the name Hunter Valley, and that's a place. But to a computer, if it doesn't have the knowledge resource to outline locations, there's no way to distinguish between these different options, particularly if we are going to throw away upper and lowercase information, as we sometimes do in text analytics. Fortunately, we do have a resource that we can use for this approach, for this problem, and that is the department's species profiles and threats database, which we can turn into a gazetteer that allows us to look for all the species and community names and link that up to the taxon identifier that's in that database. And of course, we can convert from the actual text to this reserved form back and forth with a dictionary lookup. So just as a point of interest in this data set, a species can have a scientific name and one or more common name. The third challenge is to perform what is known as co-reference resolution. So on the example that you can see here on the screen, we are showing two knowledge triples that are created by the open information extraction system that we have applied in the system. This is actually, so you can see here that the first argument on the left is a pronoun, and most of the research solutions to date will allow us to link this back to the main concept, which is a done it. So in the background there, I've shown you the core document that these knowledge triples were extracted from. And that's a document about the Julia Creek Dunnet. So we know it refers to the Dunnet. In the second example, this is a harder example that really pushes the state of the art in natural language processing. And that's where we have a reference to the tail. And the question is, if we extract out this triple just as is, the question is, what does that tail relate to? And that's the tail, of course, of the Julia Creek Dunnet. But unless we insert that information back into the sentence, we lose that connection from the knowledge triple back to the main context, which is, in this case, the species of Dunnet. So co-reference resolution helps to link the arguments back to the more general concepts so that we can maintain these connections. The fourth and final challenge I'd like to share with you is that of bulleted lists. So in this data set, as in many technical documents, it makes extensive use of bulleted lists to maintain the structure of information. So we can use the entire structure. If we do that and pass the whole bulleted list to the open information extraction tool, because it's expecting well-formed grammatical sentences, it's going to get really confused. But it's obvious that we can't ignore the structure either. It's key in linking the information in those points in a very specific way. So what we do is we transform the bulleted list into a structure that you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner. We try to identify the type of the list, and we associate that type with each of the list elements. And an interesting thing about the bulleted list that we get in this document set is that the bulleted lists can have actually more than one fragment and more than one sentence. So we process subsequent sentences and link that back to our overall structure so that we can again maintain the context of the information as it's presented in the main PDF document. So those are the four main challenges that we faced in getting the open information extraction tools to work on this data set. In this next section, I'll show you what our system architecture looks like, and I'll show you how we present the knowledge triples to the user. Having worked on knowledge triples and graphs before, we were conscious of the fact that it can be quite confusing if we just show a graph to the user without carefully considering how best to present this information. And for many of you who've visualized large graphs before, you'll know how difficult it can be for these visualizations to be of use when we want to search and browse through that data. We've all seen, I'm sure, hairball style graphs, which can look pretty, but may not be the most useful presentation method. So to guide how we presented the data, we employed some user experience methodology to design the proof of concept application that we implemented. But first, let me talk about the system. So just to remind everyone, there were 4 technical challenges, and each of these, in our handling of each of these challenges, we had a resulting software component that we linked roughly in the structure that you see there on the screen. At the end of the 3 green modules there, we end up with a sentence that we can send to the open information extraction module. And in this work, we're trialing 3 different open information extraction solutions, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So we want to have a way to merge the knowledge triples from each sentence. So we have a graph construction step right at the end. So for the data scientists out there, this is what our architecture roughly looks like. Ours is a platform that, what I'm showing here is a platform that permits testing of the different components, different optional components that you can see illustrated here on the screen. So in some of the boxes there, you'll see that there are alternative modules, and we can use a configuration file to specify which exact solution to use. Do we use Apache Tika, or do we use Amazon's TextTrack, for example? Depending on the PDF digitization solution that we use, we then infer some of the document structure and break up that structure into eligible blocks of text or paragraphs of text. These then go into the first pipeline, which identifies things like species names through the domain preprocessing and ecological community names. We then divide those paragraphs up into sentences, and again, we have 2 different possible solutions here. We can use the Spacey tool or the OpenNLP software library. And then we send the text on to our co-reference resolution module and our bullet list handler. At this point, we have different sentences and the context that we can send to the open information extraction tool. And we're using 3 tools, one called Clause.ie, OpenIE, and a neural network method from the Allen AI Institute. And these were the 3 leading open information extraction tools that we were able to find. The Clause.ie is able to break complex sentences up into parts. The OpenIE is one of the most well-known open information extraction tools out there. And as I said, the Allen AI tool uses a neural network to process the text. Clause.ie and OpenIE, I should say, are hybrid solutions that use a mixture of statistical natural language processing methods and rule-based methods. So once the sentences have been processed, they get sent to an Elasticsearch module. We can look at this through the Kibana data exploration tool, or we can send that through to our graph construction module and onto our proof of concept application. So I'll say a little bit about our proof of concept application in a second, but we undertook a user requirements method and identified 6 core areas that we needed to include to think about when we implemented our solution. And that is to provide a single interface to the source documents and the derived knowledge, to have that knowledge and text browsable and searchable in some way, to show that it's possible to combine the knowledge across different documents, and crucially to provide some information about the data provenance and the traceability of the extracted knowledge, so that context of where each key piece of knowledge comes from. Because without this context, it's hard to interpret or understand what was the intended meaning of that triple, independent of that context. So I'll just swap to a live demo here, just to show you how the system works. So we can search for a term like koala. And the system knows that some documents refer specifically to a species. So of course, there's a conservation advice about the koala. So it's going to pull content directly from this document, but it will also search for all sentences that mention koala, so that we'll get content from a range of different documents. So we'll say we want to include the koala conservation advice. And here's the automatically extracted title. The system pulls out the information. We have some statistics about where the content is coming from. These are the number of sentences from the different documents, pages, and section headings. This is some statistical information about the kind of language that we're encountering. But what I want to show you here is that content is being pulled from different documents. So we have the conservation advice for the koala, but we also have the advice for an ecological community here. As you can see, if I click on one of these tabs, it shows me more content. I'll just show you that we can always go back to the raw source document here by clicking on that button here. And in fact, we have links back to the relevant sections of the document at various points in this interface. I'll just show you what happens when we look at the description of the koala. And if I show you the results of the co-reference resolution, let me just toggle this form here. It is one of Australia's most distinctive iconic wildlife species. The question is, what is it? Well, the system has worked out, of course, that it is the koala. So we're always keeping track of that context so that when it comes to linking these triples to create the resulting graph data structures that we will want to work with in the future, we know what those references refer to. So let me just swap back to the slides here. I'm showing here just the context and how we maintain that. So I mentioned before co-reference resolution. Just want to show you here how that's working behind the scenes. So this is a sample paragraph about the plant, the Southport Heath. And I've highlighted here what some of the main concepts are in that first argument. We start off with a general concept, Southport Heath, but as the paragraph progresses, the knowledge and the sentence talks about a more specific part of the plant, talks about the leaves, and then further down, it talks about the pointed tip of the leaf. And so we can see it goes from Southport Heath to leaves, to pointed tip, and back to Southport Heath. So we're able to extract that information here on the screen. You can see that the knowledge we are able to extract is that Epicris stuarti, which is the Southport Heath, it has a leaf, and moreover, it also has a pointed tip. And that pointed tip is pungent, and that's the main point in the fourth sentence of that paragraph. So we're able to keep track of that shifting context as we go from the general to the more specific. So our proof of concept application relies not just on natural language processing methods and information retrieval methods, but also on text mining methods. So what we're showing here is a graph representation of some triples that describe the interaction between two species. So we look for sentences where there were two or more species names as evidence of some kind of relationship or potential relationship. And we're depicting this here with a Sankey graph visualization. So here on the left-hand side, you can see we're talking about the koala, and we want to see what the potential interaction is to the swamp oak species. So if I follow that Sankey diagram, it's an interactive diagram, and I've got a screenshot here. But if we move the mouse over the final column that shows us the underlying sentences that provide some evidence of a relationship, you can see here that we see that the swamp oak is a potential secondary habitat for the koala population. And indeed, if we clicked on that last box in the right-hand corner, it would take us to the page in the PDF that would show us where that sentence came from. So in terms of our feasibility study, we identified a particularly useful pipeline, and that was the combination of the PDF.js tool with the species sentence segmentation and the LNAI neural network approach. That was one of the better performing versions of our pipeline. As I said, with our platform, we can test different variations of this pipeline. We looked at the ability of our system to find eligible sentences and saw that we were able to obtain an accuracy roughly of 80% to find the eligible sentences. So that's a binary classification task. Is it eligible or not for knowledge extraction? And we evaluated this based on a sample of our data set, which we annotated for this purpose. For the eligible sentences that we were able to identify, we had looked to see how many of those we could convert into some knowledge structure, to one or more knowledge triple. And we found that 85% of those eligible sentences yielded at least one knowledge representation. And if we look at the proportion of the original sentence and the knowledge triples that were created, we saw that 95% of the content of the words in the original sentence could be mapped across to some form, some knowledge in the knowledge representation. We don't have a ground truth data set for this, so we looked at a particular case study for the koala, and we found that we were able to identify text evidence for 9 out of the 10 known threats as they're specified by the SPRAT database that I mentioned earlier, the species protection database. So the end result is we were able to extract out a significant part of the content and the text from the data set that we were working with here. So this feasibility study, I realize I'm going a little bit, running out a little bit on time, so I'll move a little bit faster through these next sections. The feasibility study here is just the first step, and we're looking at how we can apply these tools to support department workflow in the future. The first is that, the question is how can a data analyst then use the knowledge triples that we pulled out here? So we're proposing and instrumenting our application further so that we can convert the knowledge triples, convert a subset of the knowledge triples that will be relevant for answering a particular research question, and convert that into a graph structure that the data analyst can then use, perhaps with some graph algorithms if they wish, or whatever data analytics method that the analyst feels is appropriate. So the idea, just to set the scene, is not that we want to visualize these graphs any differently, but we want to apply different tools to them. So as an example, for experts in phenology, and I'm told that this is a research area that looks at periodic plant and animal life cycles, one might want to create an updated model of the risks to threats to the species. For example, in response to recent devastating bushfires this year. And one particular piece of information that could be helpful is knowing the physical traits of a species. So as you might recall earlier, I showed you how Southport Heath, Epicris stuarti, we were able to show that it has a particular physical trait, and that its leaves have a pointed tip. So being able to pull out information like this, I'm told, can help with research questions in phenology. A second benefit is to address one of the bottlenecks in the overall process for creating these documents, and that's authoring these conservation advices. There's a constant need to update them and to create new documents, and the second way that we're looking at building on this is to capitalize on the knowledge that is extracted, is already contained in the existing conservation advices and recovery plans, and see if the authors of these documents can utilize them, build on them, start with them to create the new documents. It's about avoiding a duplication of effort. If there's already relevant content that can be drawn on or that needs to be referenced in some way, it's about highlighting these to the author or providing new productivity tools so that the author can consider these when creating the new document. So, for example, a recovery plan that might mention different species might want to reference the conservation advices for the individual species, for example. And finally, the last idea that we're looking at is perhaps using this technology to provide a unified view of the different related documents across states and territories and the Commonwealth. So to provide a single database of this knowledge, to capture all that conservation knowledge into one single repository, as I said, that's automatically created and always up to date with respect to the latest documents. So to wrap up, I talked about a reusable PDF processing platform to extract out knowledge from PDFs. Our first case study was to look at conservation advices and recovery plans from the department. And we showed that not only could we extract a significant portion of these, of the knowledge from those documents, but that the knowledge, even in our initial proof of concept application, allows us to dive into aspects of the conservation process, such as looking at threats and looking at other specific information pertaining to recovery plans. So while we're interested very much in helping to protect our threatened species, we are also interested in looking to see how we can do this across other document sets for other departments. So looking to see how we can unlock knowledge in other document repositories in both government and industry. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about these methods and this technology, please do get in contact with us here at Data 61 so that we can look at how we can broaden this technology to meet the needs across whole of government. Thank you very much.